All right, hello. Chapter 12, Creating the Global Economy. And it's going to be interesting. Maybe as we go through this lecture, we'll kind of connect with how what we're going through with the global pandemic is affecting the economy. But the economy, as we're going to talk about, is not just the national economy anymore. We have a global economy. And I guess the reason I would mention the best example of that is how many of you use either an iPhone or a Samsung, which are either American products like the iPhone, made heavily in China, or a foreign product, Samsung, which is Korean, but manufactured around the world, and don't even think anything about it. Okay, so we're going to kind of get into this whole idea. And the first thing with the global economy is you need to talk about travel distance, and this will make sense in a little bit. So if you think about traveling, this kind of map shows you, you know, how far could you travel from New York in one day? And in the 1800s, the fastest way to travel was pretty much by foot, maybe on horseback, but you could only get maybe as far as uh, maybe Philadelphia, Long Island, use this little area here, right? By 1830, we had the beginning of the railroad, so you could go as far as maybe Philadelphia. By 1857, you could cover up much of New England, you can see right here, in one day of travel. And by 1939, or 1930 right here, you could travel this blue zone. So by 1930, you could go from Chicago to New York in one day, right? Then we add in air travel by 1930, and then by 1934. So by 1934, it was possible, if not very expensive, to travel from San Francisco to New York in one day. And now we think nothing of that. But this has a definite effect on the geography of economic actions. So we have this idea of space-time convergence. And as space and time converge, uh, this widens the area that economic transactions can take place in. Okay, and that as transportation has improved and gotten faster, it's allowed us to trade and have economic relationships more closely with farther and farther areas apart. Okay, and this all begins with maritime navigation, boats. Up until 200 years ago, the fastest way to get around was by boat. It was faster to sail across the ocean than to travel on the back of a horse or a camel behind a wagon. And once the invention of the compass became widespread, and in case you don't know, who knows, a compass is something that allows you to track north so that if you're in the middle of the ocean, you know where you are. And now you can sail directly. This allows navigation on a maritime basis across vast oceans. And this begins the first network of trade routes. Okay? And maritime trade is what allows Europe to basically conquer and control the Americas. It's what allows Europeans to become the dominant economic force in the 1900s and control most of the world in the form of empire. But it also is what allows coffee to be drank everywhere, or chocolate. If you think about it, bananas. I use this example all the time. Bananas, unless you have a greenhouse, you're not going to grow them in Chicago. Everyone loves bananas. If it wasn't for this global trade, we wouldn't have it. But the very first good that was traded was luxury goods. Because in the beginning of this, with the advent of maritime trade, it did allow us to connect from around the world, but it was still expensive to ship things around the world, right? So luxury goods cost more, you can charge more, they have a higher profit margin as opposed to things that are cheap. So when we get into boats, what really brings us into the modern world, especially economically, is this idea of the age of steam. Up until about the 1830s, 1840s, boats were powered by sails, by the wind. And what happens if the wind slows down or dies? Then your ship slows down. So with steamboats, as you can see right here, right, one thing, steamboats have more capacity. There's more room on the boat to hold things because you don't need to store the sails. Secondly, it's more reliable. If you have a schedule and you know that if put the boat into, third gear, you're going to cross this ocean in 2 weeks. Whereas before you had to hope that the winds held up. Now you can say that I'm going to be here It's more reliable. You can plan on it. You can make it better. And in the end, it's actually faster. It's faster because you don't have to travel with the wind. You can go straight wherever your engine takes you. And because it is faster, and because you don't need to have as big of a crew to run the sails, you don't need as many people, and inevitably it's cheaper. And so what happens is, as it becomes cheaper to ship goods, to trade them, you can put your bananas on a boat and sail it to New York and sell your bananas. Or whatever your product is, what happens is areas around the world are now beginning to basically specialize in what they do best. Because before this world economy, everything that you ate, that you used, that you wore, had to come from within, a couple 100 miles. Your clothing, your food, any kind of, furniture or machinery or tools. But now, if you can buy things from around the world, right, and Honduras makes bananas cheaper than Panama, then they have an advantage. This idea of comparative advantage, that every part of the world has something they do well. And if they can focus on just that and specialize in that, that'll make them even better at it. So comparative advantage also, again, comes with reduced transport costs. If it costs too much to ship something, then you're not going to be able to specialize. Okay? It also allows you, as an economy grows, if you're looking for something, if your economy needs a certain material, like wood, to make furniture, for instance, you can go further and further as transportation improves to find better costs. So after the age of sail, the next big area of opportunity was inland canals. So the Erie Canal is a great example. The Erie Canal was built in New York between, you can see, the 1800s. It connected essentially New York City to Buffalo. Now, why is that important? Because it was an all-water route, and at the time, this was faster and more reliable between the Atlantic Ocean and Buffalo on the Great Lakes. And so you could actually ship goods much cheaper. The effect cannot be misstated. If you look at this, the Erie Canal opened in 1825, and Chicago became a city in 1837, due in large part to the massive influx of people and goods that were able to get to the Great Lakes from New York City, and then had sailboats through Lake Erie and Lake Michigan all the way through. Okay, had a humongous reduction in not only time but cost. It basically dropped the cost of something to be shipped by 3 to 4 times and easily shaved off the time. Another thing it did was all along this canal, all these cities you see, Rochester, Newark, Syracuse, as people and goods were traveling up and down this basically water highway, they grew as well. So Syracuse and Rochester and Utica became some of the first industrial cities in the country because they could easily ship their goods along the canal. And so all along the canal, this whole changed. This was the main method of transportation for commercial goods up until the railroads became prominent in the 1850s and 60s. And when the railroads came in, as we'll talk about, they even further compressed time and space. Because it used to take, with the Erie Canal, roughly 2 weeks to get from New York to Chicago. But with the railroad, by the 1890s, it would take 2 days. Okay? And once the railroads became dominant, the canals became less so. And what happens is a lot of these towns kind of faded away. Their industry moved because being on the canal wasn't as vital anymore. So railroads became the next big step. And again, declining travel time. Here's an example right here. This is a graph of the travel time between Boston and New York City. And in the year 1800, by stagecoach, it took on average about 4,500 minutes. And it got a little faster as they made the roads better. But then you look at right here, 1860s railroad, now it's down to 800 minutes. So it dramatically drops. Today, you can drive the distance in about roughly 320 minutes or about 3 or 4 hours. So, in a sense, Boston and New York haven't physically moved together, but time-wise they have. How many of you measure places by how long it takes to? Oh, I'm half an hour away from school. I'm 20 minutes from the lakefront. Okay? As this happens, and this happened across the country, now people could interact with other people. So, for instance, before this, Boston and New York could have been on opposite sides of the country for the distance, right? To go back and forth was easily 2-3 days of travel. But now, today, there are people that commute back and forth. There are people who fly, well, before we had to shut the airplane down, right? They fly back and forth across the country. Um, and that makes possible the space-time convergence. You can interact with more people. So if you're in New York and you can only interact with people in New York, but now you can also interact with people in Chicago or Detroit or San Francisco, it's a much bigger range. And so goods become cheaper, there's greater interaction, and it allows for more innovation. This map is kind of hard to read. It's a good example. This right here is a map of England. Here's London, and here's Stranraer, which is a small town in Scotland. And this is what it looks like on the map, on the globe. So this is a physical map. This is a time-space map. All these dots are train stations. And to take a train from London to Stranraer will take you 9 hours. So everything in this circle is 1 hour from London by train. 2 hours, 3 hours. So you can see that even though it's only this far, it almost looks like it's been distorted. And think about this, right? Stranraer is a small town and London is a big town. You notice that right here, this city right here, Inverness, on the map is actually right here. It's actually further from London, but it's a bigger town. And so the train line from Inverness to London is an express direct route. It runs more often. In fact, it runs 4 hours more often. So even though it's further away physically, it's 4 hours closer. If you're in Chicago and you want to go downtown, you can take the train from almost anywhere. Any bus gets you right downtown. All the train lines come downtown, right? What if you want to go from the lakefront to the airport by public transit? That's a lot longer ride, isn't it? You might have to connect buses 2 or 3 times or different trains. So even though physically some areas are closer, transportation with the effect of time can almost in a sense warp the physical map, can it? It bends the physical space and is not always in an even way, right? So to get to Stranraer, you probably go from London to Liverpool, then change trains and go to Carlisle, and then over here. And so it just gives the effect of making this even further when it's not. Now, that can happen in a lot of things. This video will kind of help you understand. Alright, so this website I found, and if you want to play with it, it's really easy. Mapnificent, oneword.com. It's kind of neat. They take data from public transit, and what they're showing is how far can you get from public transit in a certain amount of time. So let's zoom in right here in Chicago. Let's move our little pointer here to where we are. Alright, so let's drag it here. We're at the corner of Lake and Wabash. Okay, so that's Lake and Wabash. And that's how far. Let me get rid of this one. Well, let me get rid of it. Oh well. Ignore that one. But look right here, Lake and Wabash. How far can you get from the corner of Lake and Wabash by public transit or walking? And what's our time frame here? In 15 minutes. Let's make it 6 minutes. So in 6 minutes, either by train or bus or walking, right? You can pretty much walk here, but you could catch a bus, right, up Clark Street. Maybe catch the bus right here. But let's make this more realistic. Let's just say 30 minutes. And you'll notice that in 30 minutes, right, you can get pretty far by train or by bus. But notice that you have these kind of looks like little arms or legs sticking out. Here's one, and you have these circles. So I want you to think about it. I'm going to tell you what they are, but just think about why would that happen? Why do you have these gaps right here? Let me zoom out. If you look at this, according to this map, in 30 minutes, you can get all the way up to these little spots in Evanston. And what these are train lines. This is the Green Line heading out to Oak Park, right here. So you ride the Green Line. So if you were to walk you wouldn't be able to get that far. But with the train, you have these are bus stations, right? So this is right here is the metro. You can take the metro up here, and there you go. Let's zoom out even more. Well, roughly 45 minutes. There we go. And you can see now, you can start seeing the train lines really show up, right? Because by public transit, you can get here to the station. Let's zoom in right here, right? And then you can get off and walk around. And if I keep on zooming out, it's going to eventually change. But let's do this. Let's drag this pointer. Let's put this over here. Let's go way over here. Way out in the burbs. Okay, Rochelle. Now notice in Rochelle, 45 minutes is that little circle, right? And why is that? Rochelle has no public transportation. So that's as far as you can get in a walk. What about, let's see, maybe DeKalb. Again, they do have public transit. Let's go back into the suburbs. Let's go here to Schaumburg. There you go. And again, it's smaller than downtown, bigger than way out in the middle of the country, because they still have more public transit options. And so this is another example of how transportation methods, right, can warp physical space. If you can't drive, this shapes your world in a lot of ways, right? Many of us who who don't drive right now or don't have a car, that shapes where you live and where you work. So another example of the space-time convergence. I'm going to end the lecture right here, and then when we come back, we'll start back with part 2.